what's the role of these digital consultants in engineering firms? And then how do they drive innovation and value in AEC projects?
So I touched on it earlier, but I think the adage I like to use is that, we bring software, data, technology, working with our clients to understand the kinds of problems that they have within their organization. And then there's the how we do it, which is, almost looking to our own processes and operations with design, project management, and saying, how can we solve those? How can we change how we do our stuff? We like to...
Welcome to this episode of the AEC Engineering and Technology Podcast, a podcast dedicated to helping engineering professionals find technology that fits their needs. The term digital consultant may be new to some, but their impact on the architecture, engineering, and construction industry is transformative. By leveraging technology and innovative processes, these experts help AEC companies overcome challenges, optimize efficiency, and stay competitive in an ever-changing landscape. In today's episode, I'm joined by Zak, Associate Principal and Digital Services Portfolio Leader for Americas East at Arup, to talk about how digital consultants streamline workflows, enhance collaboration, and drive exceptional project outcomes. If you're aiming to stay ahead in the AEC industry and take your projects to the next level, this conversation will reveal whether digital consultants are the key to unlocking success. I'm your host, Nick Heim, and this is the AEC Engineering and Technology Podcast. With that, let's jump into today's episode. It's now time for our conversation of the week with Zak Kostura. Zak, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the show, and welcome.
Thanks, Nick. It's good to be here.
So again, we've got a lot of good topics to talk about today, so we'll dive right into it. Zak, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, how you transitioned from being an engineer to a leader in digital services, and what led you to your current role as an associate principal and digital services portfolio leader for Americas East at Arup?
Yeah, sure. So I've been with Arup for 21 years. I came right out of graduate school and joined Arup, and I was a structural engineer. And I got, the good fortune of being placed on some projects early on that involved a fairly hefty amount of computation and focused on some high performance structures like cable nets and things like that. And so I had the ability early on in my career, I think, to start to think about alternative workflows, partly because the subject matter was tricky and really sort of warranted a different approach to it. And I was a structural engineer for about, 15 years. I'd say I was just a straight structural engineer, broadening over that time to be more full-fledged project manager, right? So as you do in a consulting engineering firm, you start to take over ownership of the delivery of other trades like mechanical and electrical. You work directly with the clients. You start to see a more holistic delivery of the overall project at the end of design. And one of my last projects was a very ambitious airport project that partially got built before it was canceled down in Mexico City. I was leading the design of a space frame roof for the project. It was absolutely massive on a very aggressive timetable. And we arrived at this sort of conclusion that the only way to design this was to design software that designs this roof. And so we did that. And so we sort of moved into the space of developing sort of cloud native software solutions for design, very one-off, very niche for this project. But after that one ended, the organization had a thought that maybe there was a way of doing this similar type of approach on other projects as well. And so I was given the opportunity to pull together people like me, software developers or computer science majors that had been sat individually in different conventional engineering teams, and kind of put them together into a digital team. And that digital team kind of came together in 2010s. And under the leadership of a few people, including myself, it sort of germinated into a team of, broader software developers and geospatial consultants. And when I joined that team in 2019 or so, it was very early on in its stages. And I had the sights of us as a team becoming full-fledged, capable of delivering enterprise software, but also being able to help clients with specifically tricky technological issues where, software, data, technology could be the answer for them. And so over the last 5 years or so, I've helped that team sort of gain an understanding of what we can do. So we found our value proposition. We found our target client markets out there. We've started to connect with them. We've built ourselves a base of, clients that come back to us for repeat work. We've built those relationships. And at the same time, we've turned inward and we've looked at the way we've delivered other types of projects, more conventional scope across rail and aviation and property. And we found different ways to use software, data, technology to change that as well. So we consider that part of our remit to work internally in changing those things as well.
Really nice summary, Zach. And I want to hone in on one point you made, which is leading those teams to building enterprise grade software, because from the one person Excel sheet to the organizational wide software deployment, there's varying levels in between. But could you speak, with coming from your level of experience, like what's the differentiator between a team that's able to do that and then let's just say a bunch of rogue individuals that I think a lot of firms have, where it's like, I've got a spreadsheet here, I maybe developed a couple Python scripts here, but it's definitely not ready for prime time, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of aspects to it, Nick, but if I sort of boiled it down to just a few, I think a sophisticated team, first off, can evaluate the business case of something, right? Is this a task that's going to happen once? Is it going to happen a few times on a project? Is it going to happen a bunch of times across projects? Is it a problem that not just we have, but others have outside of our organization? And really starts with the, understanding the business case for doing a process differently. And then the mature team has the ability to understand a process by which you figure out what are the options for doing it differently, and what is the option we're going to pick in order to do this differently. And in that, it might be, just clean up your Excel spreadsheet, right? It could be as simple as that, but it could also be, we're going to take this and do it a bit in a different way. It might be uploading it to Google Docs and just having a cloud-based spreadsheet. It might be implementing a third-party product like SharePoint with Power BI. Or it might be something where you want to get a bunch of software developers and cloud architects and you want to build enterprise-grade software. But when you get to that end, that's a big undertaking, right? It takes a lot of effort and it takes another level of maturity, which is how do you do that without consistently going over budget and over schedule and disappointing everyone with the nature of the outcomes because they expected something different, right? There's a whole product and digital project management ethos that needs to be developed within an organization to do that, right? And anybody who's done any element of digital is perfectly familiar with saying, yeah, I'll get that to you next week, and then realizing that wasn't at all realistic, right? We used to have an adage that, these digital things, whatever you think the cost is, tack on another 100%, right? And that was sort of like where we started with all of this before we got a little bit more sophisticated and understood how software is delivered. But the key thing is that may not be the right answer, right? You got to talk to the people, you got to evaluate the business case, and you got to arrive at that through some sort of objective process that's compelling and convincing that you should do that, right?
And Zach, I like to say it's, we're engineering consultants or contractors or whatever, wherever you may fall in the value chain. We're not software developers. But to be said, sounds like with your team, right, you have that capability in-house, but understanding when and when not to deploy that capability is key.
I think so. And, even there, Nick, I mean, if people are, moving into the space where they're assembling teams of software developers, the type of software, the type of use case that you solve is, you can't solve them all. I was talking to someone internally yesterday about a desktop piece, right? Like an exe file that we would want to build. And, we agreed that that's not something that our software developers have the skills or capability of doing. So just as you would approach, a certain type of engineering, right? A certain type, if I wanted to do concrete high-rise residential structures, I need to have engineers trained in concrete high-rise residential structures. And the same thing applies in the digital and technology space. And part of your litmus test of are you mature enough is you understand the landscape and you can say we're good at this and we're not good at this. And you move into a space of being good at specific things incrementally with a business case for doing that because there's enough work for people and there's enough profit to be made and all of that, right? And it sort of isn't too far away from the core ethos of the organization.
And that's the role of any good consultant, right, Zach, is that understanding of the business use case and then figuring out what to do, which is a great segue into our next question. So your team, right? The title are essentially digital consultants that work with you. But what's the role of these digital consultants in engineering firms, and then how do they drive innovation and value in AEC projects?
Yeah. So I touched on it earlier, but like I think the adage I like to use is that, we bring software data technology and evaluate both what we do as an organization and how we do it, right? So the what we do part is working with our clients to understand the kinds of problems that they have within their organization that can be addressed through software, data, digital technologies, and then of course, other things that we know as well, like AI and digital twin. And then there's the how we do it, which is, almost looking to our own processes and operations with design, project management, and saying, how can we solve those? Like, how can we change how we do our stuff, right? And I think on the first part is where we really like to be as much as possible, the what we do. We like to look at those challenges. We like to help clients improve their organizational and operational processes, right? If you've got a client with a fleet of data centers and they're having issues with efficiencies, either delivering them consistently or delivering them on schedule, they might have specific pain points around the amount of cut and fill excavation they need to move with their data centers. You can say, well, maybe there is a digitally led approach that allows you to change your process at that particular point to get a better outcome, and work with them to define the problem. Then, as I said before, evaluate the range of solutions, pick the right one, and then with the people we have, if it's appropriate, deliver that solution. Otherwise, help them procure and set up that solution, right?
Really, really well said, which again is another great segue because there's so many of these technologies, whether you have the capabilities to build them in house, maybe somebody's using something that, somebody else just isn't aware of. And as, AI, we'll get into this a little bit later, grows and more products come to market, right? There's a lot to understand and keep track of. So what are the steps you guys take to develop and maintain these competencies and emerging technologies within the team and then the company as a whole?
Yeah, it's a challenge. And I think that all of the organizations in the AEC space are contending with over the last, what would you say, 5-7 years has been just an explosion around prop tech, construction tech, right? It's startup led now, I think, where you've got small organizations that have found traction in getting a wide range of funding, right? Whether it's angel investing or venture investing, or, in the case of Arup, right, what we will do is provide technical services for, a share of equity in the organization sometimes, or a revenue share model. There's a lot of different ways an individual with an idea can try to incubate that idea. And to what you just said, Nick, it's less now about how do we develop all of the solutions for all of the problems, and more, how do we figure out who is developing the best solution for a particular problem, and to know how to implement that or what to recommend to our clients. And it's a different game now to do that. And, there's a lot of organizations. I can think of Suffolk Construction and Thornton Tomasetti alongside Arup and Shop are all organizations that have their own teams of individuals that are kind of ventures-like, in the sense that they're partnering with startups. They're trying to make it easier for the startups to overcome those big early stage barriers. They're trying to connect them to the market. And what we're seeing is that there's a whole community, sometimes around organizations like Built Worlds or local meetup groups. But people in those industries are in those organizations are actually partnering up to say, look, I'm overwhelmed. You're overwhelmed looking at all these startups. Let's start sharing notes. So I'd say it takes a lot of resources within an organization, and we certainly have a wide range of people looking at different emerging technologies. But then we also participate in those organizations with other, you can call them competitors, but in this space, it's sort of like a rising tide lifts all boats, right? It's like if they adopt the technology they think is really great and no one else does, and then technology is not going to take off. Right. So it's sort of like there's a reason for us to come together as an industry and as a community to gain a collective understanding of this fast moving ecosystem of startups and solutions, and figure out the lessons learned as we go, share that knowledge. AI can probably help us with that. But, good old fashioned networking, meeting, conferencing, that's helping out a lot too.
And I love your mindset here, Zach, because I know there are some firms who are very open about sharing what they're finding for the benefit of the entire industry. Others take the opposite approach and keep things close-chested, but I think the former is way better because you're right. If we can all come together and figure out a better way
Yeah.
for the industry, because look at who we're serving, right? We're serving communities, we're serving the general public, and anything we do is for the betterment of all. So I'm really excited to hear that's the stance you guys take as well. And you'd mentioned AI a little bit, Zach, right? Everybody's number one buzzword for, I think we're a little
Yeah.
bit over 2 years now since
Yeah.
ChatGPT's models became publicly available, right? So it's been in the public eye for a while. Everybody loves to talk about it, but from your point of view, how is AI transforming engineering workflows, and what opportunities do you see for continued adoption in our industry?
I see, I see huge opportunities. I know that there are varying viewpoints as to whether or not the hype around AI is overblown or not. I think that there are questions about whether the valuation of AI companies is commensurate with, the sort of the commercial value proposition in the coming few years. But I think from what I've seen and what I've personally experienced, it's not a matter of just staying ahead of the curve to adopt. It's about not falling behind, because I think AI is really transformational. And anybody who is looking at the early stage startups that are happening right now around using generative AI to build BIM models, right, or generative AI to just simply learn from certain design practices around timber structures and figuring that out in an empirical way. We can go ahead and say that, at the end of the day, an engineer will need to stamp those drawings for a long time, and they're right. But the overall role of a consultant is going to change dramatically, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years, as these models become increasingly more capable of just simply doing what a good consultant could do, right? Listening, taking our own knowledge and expertise from past projects, synthesizing it for the context of the current client, and putting it out there. And if everybody who's a savvy consultant of 10 plus years knows that the most important thing you really do is help a client with the decision making, right? You're there, you guide them through a process, and through that process, they end up with the building, the rail terminal, the airport, the water system, whatever it is, the asset that they need to have, right? And I think that there's a huge part of that whether we're talking about large language models or we're talking about very narrow AI that's doing highly analytical stuff, I think that stuff is going to be really important and transformational. And already we're seeing inside of Arup some really exciting use cases right now to help project managers in particular do their stuff better. And I, as a project manager, I spend half my day working with, AI now in order to help me with the toughest stuff I do as a project manager.
And even more exciting to hear that, Zach. And I know we try to bring guests on the show that either have products themselves and can share it with the audience, or ideas. And again, to the audience, we'll talk about Zach's contact information a little bit later in the show. But if any of this is piquing your curiosity, please either reach out to people like Zach or myself or anybody at EMI, because we're, again, all in this together and trying to just impact the industry for the better. And Zach, your journey is really interesting, right? 15 years as a structural engineer, and then moving into this digital role where you're now, like we talked about earlier, you've got about 15 people underneath you. So what are some of the key challenges you've seen that engineers face when they're shifting from this traditional role, right? Structural, mechanical, electrical, engineering to technology-focused domains, and how can they navigate those transitions?
Yeah, well, it's a lateral move, Nick. It's like anybody going from one area of expertise or one industry to another. It's something that you have to walk into with your eyes open. And I think, look, I was one of those sort of wide-eyed, people like I'm already kind of doing digital and structures. In my case, I'm going to go over and be this groundbreaking digital practitioner. And I think what I learned that I continue to see learned by people who make that jump is that you have to be willing to go from being a domain expert in the thing that you went to school for, the thing you've been practicing, with a little bit of digital flair, right? And it could, a lot of people think of themselves as really deep digital practitioners, but like your core competency is like your base domain, and you've been deploying it through tech. And then you go over to be a digital consultant where your base domain is now tech. And what that kind of means, or what I have found that means, what it certainly means in a multidisciplinary consulting firm like Arup, is instead of being grounded in, for my case, structures and saying, every day I'll decide whether I deliver that through a digital approach or not. It's like you come in one day and you're delivering things through a digital approach, and it may not be structures anymore, right? You're a technologist. And if you have come in and you have chosen to be a back-end software developer or a data scientist or a front-end developer, and you have to pick, right? Because just like you can't be an expert in every type of structure, you can't be an expert in every type of technology, right? It's like you're doing that now. And the team that may come to you is a team that has a challenge in water, right? Evaluating watersheds or decarbonizing a building, mechanical system for a client, right? It's like, it can look very different. And I think it can be jarring to people to realize that crossing that boundary from being an engineer based on like what you've known to being a digital consultant kind of means having a different anchor. And that can be really destabilizing, even if that anchor kind of feels familiar at first. And it also means that, you're moving into a space where technology is constantly changing, and the networks, the groups, the friends, the people you go out drinking with to stay, connected to the industry, like that probably all has to change too. So it is a bit of a lifestyle change. And I think it's exciting. I have no regrets about doing it at all, but I certainly don't think I appreciated the significance of that change.
And I think that advice is really great, because at least, even if you're not speaking directly to someone, somebody may listen to this a year, 2 years, 5 years from now, you're at least giving them advice to say, know what you're getting into before you make the jump, because what you do as part of that transition may really surprise you.
Yes.
And the way I'm just picturing in my head is, take structural, for example. You're grounded in that domain, and the tentacles kind of go out with different ways of delivering what you do as a structural engineer digitally. But after crossing that chasm, so to speak, that chasm, excuse me, it sounds like, you're now grounded in digital, and one of those tentacles may be water, rail, aviation. And you might get back into whatever you were doing originally, but it doesn't sound like that's an everyday thing.
Don't think that that's guaranteed. Don't think that's because, and it's, I think one of the things we see is like sometimes people are just tired of the code manuals. Like, I don't want to open up AISC anymore. I don't want to go into ACI, right? But if you come over, you're getting your head wrapped around NIST guidelines, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or ISO, right? Software in our space is increasingly mature, and clients are expecting a certain level of certification that you need to be able to speak to. So it's not just about coding in Python. It's like, if you're going to have a career, a career move here, you need to be ready for an audit for your like SOC 2 compliance or something. And that means basically having your head in the same kind of codes as you were as a conventional engineer. They're just different, right? So you have to be ready for that level of complexity, that level of rigor. And I don't want to scare anybody away. It's exciting because it's an area where that stuff's moving fast, and there aren't a lot of people who know it in our industry. So absolutely jump on it. It's a real growth space, but it's like you said, eyes open, right? Go into it knowing that it's going to be work.
Absolutely. And Zach, one final more technical question. So I know what I notice a lot, being more on the innovation side of a company, is we're looking a couple years ahead. We think, what we have are these great solutions, but then when you bring it back to that practitioner, they don't always get it right away, which I think is okay, because it's not their job, right? That's our job to show them the value. But how do you ensure digital solutions are tailored to meet the very practical needs of these professionals who, right, they're not innovation, they're not in digital. It's, hey, I need to do my job and I need to do it well.
So I think this is a really excellent question, Nick. So I think the place to start in answering that question is by saying you gotta know the user, you gotta know the stakeholder, you have to know what they're trying to achieve. And too often, what happens is an engineer has an idea like, oh man, I've got a better way of doing this, and they just start plugging away at building some sort of fancy automated workflow or something like that. They say, oh, this is going to be a great product, there's tons of people who have this problem, and they're like, as soon as I'm done building this and I show people, they're going to get super excited. And that misses so many of the key sort of like 101 lessons in tech and change and software development and UX. It is like, even if your idea is really great and better than what they're doing, it's your idea and not theirs, right? And so by not engaging them and making them feel part of that process, you're missing out on what are your early adopters. The people are going to be the first ones to come in and say, hey, you did something and I helped you, and this is great because it looks familiar to me, and and I'm ready to take this because I know it, right? So I'd say know your user is the first thing. But there's another thing, Nick, that I think is like worth kind of thinking about too. And we kind of all know that sort of bell curve of adoption, right? It's sort of like got popularized by the Crossing the Chasm book and everything. It's sort of like you've got the people who are like the first ones to adopt a new technology, right? And then it kind of goes up to the mainstream adopting a technology or buying a product. And then you've got the sort of the laggards is what they call, or the ones on the tail end, right? And I think everybody who's in this space really needs to think about, where do you want to be on that curve? Like, I came into this and I was super excited at being on the bleeding edge. I was like, I heard the bleeding edge is even cooler than the cutting edge. But the bleeding edge, if the bleeding edge is mean you're the first one. You're like way out there with like a new technology, a new approach. Nobody's done it before. Nobody knows about it. That's great. But there's a huge amount of failure that happens, right? We see the curves for the things that succeeded, but we don't really talk about the things that failed because they never got past that initial point. Right. And there's an adage that I've heard a lot: the second mouse gets the cheese, that even if you do succeed, you go through so much inefficiency, you burn so many bridges with doing it wrong and then learning again, that someone comes by and copies it with like a fresh set of resources and wide-eyed stakeholders. And it's that, I think, like, I don't know, the Apple Vision Pro versus the Meta Quest or something like that, right? Or the Google Glass, right? It's sort of like someone incubates a technology, gets burned, ticks a lot of people off, and then someone comes by and takes the best of that. And so it's sort of like, you can be on the bleeding edge, you can be on the cutting edge a little bit behind, you can be an early adopter, or you can be part of the mainstream. And what you just said, Nick, is like, too often we in the consulting are trying to be on the bleeding edge. We don't have the resources to be there. We don't have the appetite as organizations to deal with the failure that's there. And there isn't a market. So if I were to do something super cool with the most forward-facing client in the world, I go tell that story to all our other clients. They're like, I don't need that. That's not something that's not scalable from a consulting standpoint. So you really have to think about where you as an organization want to be on that adoption curve in terms of what is a service, what is a thing you can do, and is it forward enough that it's not a commodity? Because if you wait too late, everybody can do it and there's no value and there's no profit there. But if you're too far up on it, you're getting burned too much, you're taking too much in terms of R&D resources. There's a sweet spot. I think it's a little different based on each organization's sort of makeup,
Really well said, Zach. And I think if you bring it, say, like to startup world and, doing customer research, right, you're constantly iterating through your product, and then your go-to-market strategy is going to be based on a lot of what you learned from your customers and just listening to them, having a ton of meetings. So I think to anyone that's out there listening, right, the strategy is, it's starting with what's my problem, and then what's the adequate solution, instead of the other way, right, like a solution in search of a problem. So Zach, again, great having you on. What's the final piece of advice you could give engineers that are looking to advance their careers in the digital space and then thriving in these technology-focused roles?
So the advice I usually give, I usually sort of like delineate it between the youngers, like under 35, and then the olders older. Unfortunately, I'm in the older category, but like to the young engineers that are out there, whether you're in school or you're the first decade of your career, expect your career to change. Expect you to retire doing something different than what you went to school for. I think that is just the nature of the modern world, but I also think that you're in a space where technology, particularly with AI, is going to have an impact. We don't know how big or how much, but like a good, I'm full of adages and quotes today, but I heard one that said, don't think about your career like a ladder, think about it like a jungle gym. So even if I kind of scared you away earlier, becoming a digital consultant or something, just be open to being fluid with what you do, the value you provide. Don't be stuck in one place, because I think that that is a great path to obsolescence, and you're doing yourself a disservice not being agile and fluid with how you define your impact on an organization and the people you help. So that's for the youngers. For the older people, your time is oftentimes too valuable to experiment. You're probably set more in your ways, but you're also decision makers in organizations, and you have young people. And too often what we do is we see the young people testing, trying, playing around. We see that time as potentially being inefficient or risky. And I think we need to change our mindset and say, those are the individuals that are pioneering the way that we can go forward with, first off, their youthful idealism, because everyone comes out with a playful demeanor. And the other thing is their time is cheap compared to all of the senior people in your organization. The time that they waste on a failed idea has very little downside risk compared to someone who's in their 50s or 60s trying that, right? So make space for those individuals to feel safe playing. And don't just say, I'm doing you a favor, giving you this time or this budget. Make them realize and that they are there and they are helping shepherd the direction of the firm, and that you appreciate them and what they do, because increasingly it's going to be hard to keep them. And that is a great way to keep them and to also make sure your organization is moving forward through their hard work.
Yeah, that was excellent, Zach. And somebody who like is in the former groups, like the younger, what I really like about my role is that, you know, my boss gives me that freedom, but instead of just saying, hey, just go over here, it's more of an iterative. It's like, he's got the experience, he has the knowledge, he knows what he's doing. And he says, hey, I think this is what we want to focus on. And he gives me the freedom and all of that to just go experiment and then bring it back to him. And then with his knowledge he's gained over the years, he can pretty well tell like what has promise and what we may want to stay away from. And I think that, you know, that mentoring and reverse mentoring relationship is, you know, it's worked out great for me. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for all of us in that.
I think that's one of the best ways to future-proof an organization is through that kind of approach.
Excellent. Well, Zach, thank you again so much for joining us today. If the listeners do have questions about anything we talked about or just want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm trying Blue Sky, but I don't know if I'll be there very long. We'll see. But for now, LinkedIn is great.
So, Zach, thank you again.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Enjoyed the chat.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Zach. Please remember, you can find the show notes for this episode at aectechpodcast.com. There, you will find a summary of key points discussed in today's episode, as well as links to any of the resources, websites, or books mentioned during this episode. Until next time, I wish you the best in all of your engineering and technology endeavors. Thank you.